Let me say that in my life I've seldom encountered, possibly never, anyone I have come to admire as much as our next speaker, who went through a personal travail in learning of the relationship between a woman he knew as a child, where he sat on her lap, discovered that she'd had a profound relationship with John F. Kennedy. In the course of investigating her very strange death, he discovered that his own father, who had been an agent of the CIA, had been involved in both the death of John F. Kennedy and of Mary Meyer. I tell you, this man is Admiral. Give it up for Peter Janney.
I'm going to be brief, so to speak. Jim, thank you for your introduction. I do come at the Kennedy assassination, and particularly the murder of Mary Meyer, from a little different angle, in the sense that I grew up in the belly of the beast. My father was a high-ranking CIA official. He was recruited by Allen Dulles. Our family was close friends with all the top CIA honchos: Dick Helms, Jim Angleton, Tracy Barnes, Desmond Fitzgerald. I was a CIA brat. I knew their kids. We socialized together. So all through the 1950s and in the 1960s, this was going on, but of course I wasn't aware enough to know really what was going on until many years later. I came to know the Meyer family because I was best friends with Mary Meyer's middle child, and he was killed in an auto accident when we were both 9 years old, and it was a very, very traumatic event for me. And ironically, the only person, the only adult that could give me the kind of attention that I really needed was Mary Meyer herself. My parents were, for lack of a better word, inveterate alcoholics, as were many CIA people and the sort of whole Mad Men culture in Washington, D.C. during that time. Mary Meyer was not a drinker. I mean, it's not that she didn't drink socially, she did, but she came from a very progressive, wealthy family, the Pinchot family. Her uncle was a two-time governor of Pennsylvania. Her father was one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union. And she was encouraged at a very early age to develop herself as a person, as a woman. Her mother was a very left-wing literary person, a writer. So she had this family of real progressive nurturance. In the winter of 1936, she went to a prep school dance at the Choate School in Wallingford, Connecticut, and JFK showed up at the dance. He'd already graduated, but he came back. He had been actually a freshman that year at Princeton, but he was very sick, and he was in and out of the hospital, and I think he came back to his former alma mater because, you know, he wanted to sort of get back into the swing of his social life. I sort of look at this as a moment of destiny, because when he came back to that weekend and he went to the Saturday night big festivity dance, this is when he first laid eyes on this woman, and it was for him very, very memorable. She, on the other hand, was the date of William Atwood, who would become a member of JFK's administration. And so Atwood had a really bad sore throat. He was running up and down the stairs, gargling with Listerine during the dance. And of course, when he would leave, JFK would, you know, go cut in on Mary and take and sort of, you know, enamor himself with her. So there was this little feud developing that night. Now, the romance that some might thought would have happened didn't take place. Mary was not interested in a wealthy little playboy. She already yearned for something a little more substantial in terms of intimacy in a relationship. But they did make an impression on one another, and they did continue to know each other socially all through college, and of course after college. So as I came into my own awareness of this took place in 1976. There was an article in the National Enquirer revealing for the first time that Mary Meyer and President Kennedy had had this torrid affair, and that they smoked marijuana in the White House, that kind of thing, which was all pretty cool. But I really had kind of a moment of real jarring when I found out about this. And I began to suspect that this was not a random act of murder. She, of course, was murdered 10 months after JFK was, and I'm going to get into that and tell you why. But this really had an impact on me, and I started very slowly to research what was really going on, talking to people, and it took me a long time. I mean, I literally spent 35 years before I could finish this book, because it just got deeper and deeper and more intricate as I got into it. Little did I know, for instance, that when I came home in the fall of 1964 for Thanksgiving, I didn't even know Mary Meyer had been murdered. I found out the night before Thanksgiving. It was just casually almost mentioned at the dinner table, and it just shocked me. There was something profoundly wrong, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. I just knew that I had been very, very shaken by this event. So 1976, the pieces start to come together, and as I began my own journey into this subject matter, as well as trying to understand the Kennedy assassination, I came across this document. This document. Now, if you look at this document, it takes place in 1967. It's the very first meeting within the CIA about what Jim Garrison is doing, and they are worried. Already in 1967, they're in hot water, and they know it. This person right here, who is part of this meeting, his name is Raymond Roca. He is Jim Angleton's chief lieutenant. And he's at this meeting where my father is the secretary of the meeting, recording the minutes. And Roca tells the people at the meeting that he thinks Garrison is going to get a conviction of Clay Shaw, and that they better, wise up to this and realize what the hell is going on here. So they convene this meeting. Garrison is already deeply into the investigation. And of course, a year earlier in 1966, I raised the question with my father very casually one day that Jim Garrison was opening up this investigation, and he thinks the CIA did it. And my father became apoplectic. He couldn't even tolerate the fact that I would hold such a thought. And of course, the exact opposite was happening. He knew what was happening. So you can see that this meeting is high level. The executive director, the general counsel, Ray Roca, a number of other people are at the meeting, and it's the very first meeting that they're having about Garrison in the fall of '67. So there's the actual, it's the same page. It's just enlarged a little bit so that you can read it, and of course, there is my father's signature. Now, right before this meeting, several months before this meeting, the CIA sends out a memo to all of its different stations. And this is called the CIA document 1035-1960. This is the document that asked all the people in the CIA who were in some way trying to answer rebuttals to people like Mark Lane and anyone else who was coming out against the Warren Commission. This is the document and the effort on part of the CIA to create the term conspiracy theorist, to put it into our culture and to slowly but surely make it sound that anyone who raises this kind of suspicion should be labeled as, you know, some kind of kook. They're just out trying to sell their own books. We've got to find a way to discredit these people. So the CIA, of course, worms its way into the media, and it's been doing that through something called Operation Mockingbird all through the 1950s. And this is the sort of crown jewel here that people today use unknowingly to smear people like you and me, people who raise legitimate questions about the official story. You get labeled a conspiracy theorist, you're automatically put in a little category, and people, you know, certainly in the mainstream media, they don't want to pay any attention to you. And of course, if you look at the coverage, the media coverage that has gone on in the last month, I haven't seen one story in the mainstream media that will even entertain the possibility of there being an alternative theory in conjunction with the Warren report, or the fact that somebody other than Lee Harvey Oswald might have been involved in the assassination. I mean, this is how pervasive our national security apparatus is in terms of media control. And of course, I think most of you, being alive when 9/11 took place, you can also see it there. I mean, the media will not touch that story. You have over 2,000 licensed structural engineers and registered architects going on record in one way or another saying it wasn't the planes that hit the World Trade Center building that brought those buildings down. It was controlled demolition. And then, of course, there's Building 7. No plane hit that building, and it just imploded and fell to the ground for some reason. But again, this is how pervasive our national security apparatus is in terms of media control. So I want to just bring that to your attention, and I'm going to curtail my presentation a little bit today in the interest of time, because I want to get right into what I can really talk about with some authority. People in our country until recently haven't really understood who Mary Meyer was. She was a very important person to President Kennedy. The last 3 years of his life, she was an extremely close ally to him. They were also lovers. In the fall of '63, President Kennedy told Kenny O'Donnell, his chief assistant, he confided in him that after he got out of the White House, he was going to divorce Jackie so that he could marry Mary and be with her. And she became a real pillar of strength for President Kennedy as he turned his attention away from the Cold War, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of 1962. This was possibly the most dangerous moment in all of human history. We came so close to a nuclear holocaust at that time. And this really shook President Kennedy up. It shook Premier Khrushchev up. And it's at this point that these two world leaders realize that they have to start doing something very different. All the while, before that, they were slowly developing this relationship in secret and, realizing that they really shared some of the same concerns in terms of where they wanted to take the two leading world powers at that time. But the Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. And after that event, President Kennedy really had a huge, even more profound change of heart. And it was during the year of 1963, and this is really eclipsed by what he told us in the American University commencement address on June 10th that he was taking it upon himself now to really asking all of us to re-examine our sense of what peace really meant. And he was trying to educate us about how much Russia had suffered. And he, at that very address, announced that he was going to create a limited nuclear arms treaty with Russia. And lo and behold, less than 2 months later, behind the backs of the CIA and behind the backs of the Pentagon, this treaty is put together. And on September 24th, 1963, or 23rd, it was ratified by the Senate. And of course, this sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington. This was sort of the last blow as far as the military-industrial complex was concerned. They knew they had to get rid of him at this time. And this is where, you know, the course of history, in my opinion, has irrevocably changed, and we are where we are today because of his assassination 50 years ago. So after the assassination took place, of course, Mary Meyer was very upset. She was just traumatized by what had happened. But she decided right after the assassination that she was going to get to the bottom of this, that she wanted to know what happened. She wanted to know how this went down in the way that it did. And of course, she had access to people in Washington that very few people have. And she, for instance, went and talked to Kenny O'Donnell, and I think probably Dave Powers as well. And if you remember, those two gentlemen were riding in the car right behind President Kennedy, and they are seasoned World War II combat veterans, and they were aware that there were at least 2 shots that came from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll, and those, as we know, one of those shots was the actual kill shot that ended JFK's life. So Mary had access to these people. She started getting back into using her diary to put the pieces together, what I call a mosaic. And the interesting thing is her best friend, Ann Truitt, told her son, Sam Truitt, that the reason that Mary has likely to have been assassinated 10 months later in October of '64 was that she had been talking about the Kennedy assassination. She'd actually been doing more than that. But this is really, I think, evidence of the fact as to how serious that she was taking this. So, just to run through what actually happened on the day of Mary's murder. There was a patsy. His name is Ray Crump. He was unknowingly set up to take the fall. The interesting thing is, though, is that Crump, there was never any forensic evidence linking Ray Crump to the murder scene or the body of Mary Meyer. None whatsoever. And because Ray Crump had a very seasoned, with an incredible African-American woman attorney by the name of Dovie Roundtree, here she is right here, he was able to get acquitted. Because Mary Meyer was shot twice with a .38 caliber pistol at close range. And this killing had all the markings of a skilled professional assassin. She had one shot that went through the left side of her head, going through the other side of the right side to her brain. The second shot was placed right below her right shoulder blade, angled slightly to the left. When it was fired, it immediately severed her aorta. It killed her instantly. Ray Crump had never owned a gun. No one in his family or his community had ever seen Ray Crump with a gun. And of course, Crump was denied a preliminary hearing. He was denied, the defense team was denied seeing the FBI crime report, much of which demonstrated everything that I've just said. So they really tried to railroad this guy and get a conviction 9 months later. But because of Dovie Roundtree, it just didn't happen. On the day of the murder, someone by the name of Lieutenant William L. Mitchell shows up, and he claims the following day, on October 13, that he ran by this woman, and he comes to the police and says, "Oh yeah, I think I ran by this woman, right, it must have been right before she was killed. And oh, by the way, there was this black guy following her, and he had on these clothes." And of sorts, Mr. Mitchell gives an exact description of what Ray Crump was wearing, and the police goes, here's our primary witness here, and he's even white. Now we can close the case, we can frame this guy, and we can put this to bed. Now, at the time of the trial, 9 months later, in July of '65, Lieutenant Mitchell is allegedly no longer in the Army. He's teaching, allegedly, at Georgetown University. But the problem with that is there's no personnel record for any William L. Mitchell at Georgetown. An author before me by the name of Leo D'Amour tried to research this. He couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything. So I'm beginning to get suspicious here about, well, why does he use Georgetown University when they have no record of his employment? Well, it turns out that many times the CIA uses Georgetown University as a cover for people who are working undercover or in some way working in clandestine operations at the agency. This was confirmed to me by 3 former CIA people who knew what the real drill was and what was going on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the first person to really begin to unravel Mary Meyer's murder was this author, Leo D'Amour. D'Amour actually did quite a lot of the spade work, which I credit him for. He found out, for instance, that Mitchell's address was a CIA safe house. This, too, was confirmed by 3 other former CIA people, that the address at 1500 Arlington Boulevard, it was an apartment complex known as the Virginian right outside of Washington, was a designated CIA safe house for people involved in undercover work. Now, D'Amour could never locate Mitchell. He was the only one involved in this case that he couldn't find. So at the end of 1992, he wrote him a letter and sent it to his last known address. And several years later, less than 4 months later, in March of 1993, he gets a phone call late that night. And allegedly, it's William L. Mitchell on the phone who says that he's read the letter and he's willing to talk to D'Amour because he doesn't want to be the fall guy in history. He doesn't want to have this rap on him. Now, I don't really know whether that was William Mitchell who called him. I mean, that's still up for debate, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. There's been some new information that's come to light, which I'm going to go into, and we can talk about that. What I did find out subsequently, and this was after the initial edition of my book, Mary's Mosaic, was released in April of 2012, was Mitchell had just disappeared. He just vaporized. But after the book came out, through a number of circumstances, I got a new lead on Mitchell, and it turns out that this guy had gone to Cornell University in the fall of 1957. He was in the 5-year Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering program. The interesting thing is there's not one picture of Mr. Mitchell in any of the regular Cornell yearbooks. It's just not there. There's mention of him, but the only picture of Mitchell is in his engineering section class, and that's him right there, number 76. It's a very difficult picture to really see. It doesn't tell me that much, but that's the only known picture of Mitchell taken at Cornell during his 5-year stint there. So what I started to put together is that who else in our culture do we know was recruited by the CIA while they were in college or graduate school? Well, it turns out that Robert Gates, who rose through the ranks, became head of the CIA, was also Secretary of Defense for 2 presidents, He was recruited by the CIA when he was in graduate school at the University of Indiana. And even though he was recruited, they still made him go through the U.S. Air Force under CIA sponsorship just a few weeks after joining. So here I'm starting to make the connection that, well, you know, you can be tied into the CIA, but under military cover, as was Mr. Gates for 2 years. So I postulate that, like Robert Gates, Mitchell may have been recruited into the agency while he was at Cornell. I don't know that for a fact. It's a kind of a working hypothesis. What I do know is that Mitchell graduates from Cornell in 1962, and while he's there, he is designated as a distinguished military student in the Army ROTC program. And so what I did is I got a hold of Mitchell's date of birth and the first 5 digits of his Social Security number, and I went to work in trying to find his military record, because if you're in the military, there has to be a record of that fact that's usually stashed at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. The only problem is they don't have any military record for Mr. Mitchell. It wasn't there. So the next thing I found out is that in an academic citation, Mitchell listed himself as a Fulbright scholar and allegedly went to the University of London. Yet the Fulbright people have no record of William L. Mitchell ever being involved in the Fulbright program. So I begin to think that, well, okay, there's something really fishy going on here. We can't get his military record. Is it possibly classified, and is it being held secret? So I further learned that after Mitchell's alleged military career, he earns a PhD in mathematics at the University of California at Berkeley. He then shows up as an assistant professor in the business school at Cal State University, East Bay. And he rises to the rank of associate professor of business administration. And his last listing is the 1989-90 academic year. But something really interesting happens in the 72-73 academic year. William L. Mitchell changes his name to just Bill Mitchell. He is from then on known as just Bill Mitchell. Now, what's going on in 1972 or 73? Is it possible that because of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence run by Frank Church, that's starting its investigation in 74, with published reports coming out as early as 75, followed by the HSCA in 1976, is it possible that Mitchell is hankering for a deeper level of camouflage? How many Bill Mitchells do we know? Well, there are obviously hundreds of thousands. How many William L. Mitchells? Well, that number is a much smaller pool. So I'm beginning to think that maybe Mitchell is changing his name to elude being detective. So, obviously, it didn't happen, but I'm wondering whether Mitchell was suspecting that there might be an investigation of the murder of Mary Meyer, since it happened so quickly after President Kennedy's assassination, and that this was really one of the main motivating forces to make him want to change his name. It turns out that the original Social Security for William L. Mitchell was located in New York, but Bill Mitchell uses a different Social Security number in California. And by the time of 1978, when he's purchased property in Northern California, he uses Bill Mitchell. The property is then transferred to a trust that is owned by Mitchell in 1992. And presently, Mitchell's tenure, he's emeritus now at the University of California, and this is what his emeritus bio looks like. There's no more William L. Mitchell. It's just Bill Mitchell. It's camouflaged. So, coming back to my odyssey, I discovered where Mr. Mitchell lived in the summer of 2012, and I wanted to surprise him, and I wanted to go to his house and encounter him and just see whether he would be willing to talk to me. I don't know whether the sound is going to come through, but if you, we'll see. Let's see if we can hear it. Mr. Mitchell? My name is Peter Janney. I'm an author. I wrote this book called Mary's Mosaic.
I'm not interested.
Well, I know.
See you later.
Could I just talk? Oh, I came from Boston.
I don't care. I'm not interested. See you later.
So, Mr. Mitchell wasn't happy to see me. I can't imagine why. The interesting thing is that his physical appearance, he's 70 plus years of age, but he's in great shape. He's a runner. He's trim. He's lean. He works out all the time. We located his brother earlier this year in March, and of course, his brother James doesn't want to talk to us either. So there appears to be a dirty little family secret that they just hope will go away. So with this new information, I went back to Washington and I went to the Metropolitan Police Force and I found a detective. His name is Dan Whalen. He's a senior homicide detective. He'd actually read my book. He was very intrigued by it. And so I got Detective Whalen as a law enforcement officer to go to the National Personnel Records with Mitchell's complete Social Security number, because as a law enforcement officer, he can get anybody's Social Security number. He just can't tell me what it is. So he has the real McCoy as well as his date of birth. He goes to the NPRC and says, I'd like to get Mr. Mitchell's military service record. And they call him up several days later and say, Detective, we can't locate any William L. Mitchell. We don't have it. So here we have, all the identification number and information that you would need, all the contact information that you would need to get anyone's military service record, but it's not there. So now I'm really, I'm intrigued. This is getting real. So what I did next is I decided that I would launch a civil lawsuit against Mr. Mitchell in Washington, a wrongful death lawsuit. And that case is still in adjudication. I can't talk about certain elements of the case because we're going through some delicate negotiations. But, we did file the case. My attorney is William L. Pepper. I think most of you may have heard that name. He's been instrumental, of course, in getting to the bottom of the Martin Luther King assassination. He's working on Robert Kennedy's assassination and trying to get a new trial for Sirhan at the moment. And Mr. Pepper and I, worked for months in terms of getting the complaint finally done. It was filed on August 30th, and things are going to happen. I just am not at liberty to say quite what they are yet, but you will know at some point. So, why is this case so important today? Well, one of the reasons is we have a live body. We have someone who was on the scene of that murder. I do not believe that William Mitchell was the actual assassin, but I do believe that he was part of the assassination team on the Sino Canal towpath of that day, and that he was acting as a spotter kind of capacity, there were at least two other spotters that are identified indirectly in the trial transcript. And so there's an opportunity here, I think, to, in a sense, get to the bottom of something that may tell us even more about what happened, who was behind Mary Meyer's murder. If this goes well, and I can finally dislodge Mr. Mitchell's service record, and there are clear indications in that record that he had intelligence credentials of one kind or another, That will be a very significant development. And I am currently working with another attorney in a FOIA exploration to get to the bottom of this, both within the United States Army and with a couple of other federal bureaucracies. But the point is that I thought that this might be over when I wrote the book, and I could get on with other things. It isn't over. It's not over until I get to the bottom of this. And even though this has been a very long and arduous journey, it's critically important for the truth of history for us to see if it's not possible to get to the bottom of this, because I do think it will also have ramifications for some of the forces that were instrumental in taking out our 35th president. Thank you.